The dirt road crackled under the boots of the American cowboy, the stench of sweat and horses thick in the air as he looked down at the figure before him. A young woman, her face weathered with the ghosts of war, stood silently in front of him. Her eyes were empty, but not broken. She was a Japanese comfort girl, one of the most despised, most misunderstood figures in the aftermath of the war. Yet, here she was, standing in the heart of America. No cowboy dared marry such a woman. To even consider it was unthinkable. The shame, the whispers, the stigma, it was too much to bear. But this cowboy wasn't like the others. What he did next stunned them all. What he asked of her, what he offered her, was unimaginable. The air grew heavy as the crowd waited for the answer. What would she say? What could she possibly say? And how would this break all the rules of the world they knew? She flinched not from fear but from the knowing. She could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up. They didn't see a woman. They saw something less, something shameful. She didn't dare look up. Her eyes stayed cast downward, locked on the dirt beneath her boots, as if the ground could shield her from the judgments swirling in the air. The men, American soldiers turned ranch hands, stood still, their faces unreadable. One man muttered under his breath, too low for anyone else to hear, "A comfort girl." The words carried the weight of everything she had been taught, to avoid disgrace, dishonor, worthlessness. She wasn't a woman. She was a reminder of war's cruelties, a symbol of a nation's darkest days. The shame of it all clung to her like the rags she wore. The cowboy closest to her didn't speak, but she could feel the weight of his gaze as it swept over her. She could tell he was studying her, trying to make sense of her existence, just as the others had. His hand rested lightly on the stock of his rifle, his fingers tapping absently. His eyes were cold but not hateful. They were full of something else, something she didn't know how to decipher. Her body felt too small for the space around her, and with every shallow breath she took, she could almost hear the weight of history pressing down. There was no hatred in the air, but the stigma was unmistakable. She was a symbol, nothing more. She had learned to carry that with her long ago, the broken image of a woman forced to serve as a tool of war. No one had ever treated her as anything else, and this cowboy, this stranger, was no different. His silence wasn't sympathy. It wasn't kindness. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a broken past, too heavy to carry alone. The room seemed to get colder, the barn now feeling more like a cage, its wooden beams pressing down on her. Her hands trembled as they hung at her sides, her fingers stiff from the cold. She had forgotten how to feel warmth. The air inside the barn, thick with the smell of dust and animal sweat, felt more suffocating than the coldest winter night. Her throat constricted, and for a moment she thought she might choke on the silence that surrounded her. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of their eyes, something shifted. The cowboy didn't look away. His gaze didn't waver. It lingered, steady. And even though she couldn't bear to meet his eyes, she felt it. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't pity. It was curiosity. A part of her wanted to shrink away from that curiosity, to keep herself small and invisible, as she had been trained to do. But another part of her, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human, wanted to rise, to break free from the cage of shame that had held her for so long. But not yet. Not yet. The cowboy shifted his weight, his boots creaking softly against the wooden floor. He took a step closer to her, the sound of his boots cutting through the silence of the barn. His hand instinctively reached for the brim of his hat, fingers grazing the worn fabric as if seeking comfort. A simple gesture, but in this moment it carried more weight than the gun strapped to his side. The barn, heavy with the smell of fresh hay and the faint tang of gunpowder, seemed to close in around them. The woman still didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the dirt at her feet, her posture stiff, as though she had been trained not to move unless ordered. Her shoulders, too thin for the weight they bore, were drawn tight, her chest barely rising with each breath. The air around them felt thick with tension. He didn't know why, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward her, something that tugged at the edges of his mind, urging him to step closer, to reach out, to do something. But what? He wiped the sweat from his palm on his trousers, his fingers still grazing the brim of his hat. The leather felt worn, like the old memories it carried with it. His knuckles tightened around the edge of the hat as he moved closer. His boots scraped the floor again, the rhythmic creak breaking the silence. Yet she didn't flinch. She stood there, motionless, her frailty more apparent with every step he took. His breath felt heavy in his chest, each exhale thick with indecision. What was he supposed to do? She was not like the other women on the ranch. She wasn't just a prisoner. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. He could see it in the way she held herself, the way her eyes didn't meet his. She was broken, a hollow shell of someone who had endured too much. But how could a man like him, a cowboy rough around the edges and hardened by a lifetime of sweat and dirt, make any difference? He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to hear the soft rustling of her uniform as she shifted her weight. The barn smelled of earth and straw, a sharp contrast to the sterile, suffocating air of the camps she had come from. His gaze lingered on her, tracing the outline of her form, the ragged edges of her clothes, the bones jutting out from under her skin. She was so thin, too thin. The hollows under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of hunger, of loss. The bruises on her arms, faded but still visible, told their own story. A story of pain, a story of survival. And yet, there was something else in her, something that wasn't broken, not completely. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before he lowered it to his side. The temptation to reach for her was there, an ache he couldn't shake, but he knew better than to move too quickly. He had seen women like her before, seen the scars they carried, the walls they built. He couldn't fix that, but he had to do something. He adjusted his hat again, this time with purpose, his fingers curling around the worn fabric. It was a nervous gesture, but one that gave him a moment of clarity. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure if there was anything he could do. But he could at least stop pretending she wasn't here, that she wasn't real. The woman's gaze finally flickered upward, just for a moment. The briefest glance, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected it, hadn't been prepared for the raw, desperate emptiness in her eyes. There was no anger there, no hatred, just nothing. She was hollow, empty. It made him want to do something, anything, to fill the void, to help her find something, anything of herself again. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Her gaze dropped back to the dirt beneath her feet. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The decision was still there, hanging in the balance, and with every passing second, it grew more pressing. What would he do? His hand lingered on the brim of his hat, fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't sure why it mattered, why she mattered, but something inside him was telling him that this wasn't just another woman. This wasn't just another prisoner. She was a person, and he needed to do something. But what? The air in the barn seemed to grow colder, heavier. The wind outside rattled the wooden walls, but inside it was still, too still. The silence stretched on, waiting for a decision, for something to break the tension. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what would happen if he did. The cowboy took a deep breath, his boots shifting ever so slightly in the dirt. The silence hung thick in the barn, broken only by the low crackling of the fire. He adjusted the brim of his hat again, but this time the movement was slower, more deliberate. His voice broke the quiet, steady but unexpectedly soft. "I'll offer you something different." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of uncertainty through the air. His voice held a calmness that contradicted the tension that thickened the space. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just a simple offer, like the sound of a distant bell tolling in the quiet of the night. The barn seemed to grow colder in the stillness, the smell of earth and wood filling every corner. The light above flickered once, casting uneven shadows on the walls. The woman's eyes, which had been locked firmly on the dirt at her feet, shifted, just the smallest movement, but it was enough. She looked up at him for the first time, her gaze hesitant but curious. The room grew stiller, as if time itself had decided to hold its breath. She didn't speak, but her body stiffened, and for a fraction of a second, the faintest tremor ran through her. Her breath was slightly quicker now, like the wind on a hot summer's day, brief but noticeable. Her hands, gripped tightly at the sides of her tattered uniform, trembled. Her fingers dug into the rough fabric as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the reality she had known. The woman's posture remained rigid, like a bowstring pulled too tight, poised for the inevitable release. The cowboy didn't move. He stayed where he was, his eyes steady on hers, watching for any sign of response. His words had been soft, but they felt heavy, filled with an emotion he wasn't prepared for. He wasn't sure what had made him say it, what had made him offer something no one would ever expect. But now that it was out there, hanging in the thick air between them, he couldn't take it back. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her hands still clutching her uniform, her body trembling ever so slightly. A wave of uncertainty rippled through her, a flash of fear that passed too quickly for him to catch. She had been taught not to trust, never to trust. That's what they'd drilled into her over the years. She had been broken down, used, discarded, and now, in this foreign place, in the middle of nowhere, she was being offered something she couldn't comprehend. Could she trust him? The question hung in the air like smoke, swirling around them both. She hadn't been taught how to trust. She had been taught to endure, to survive, to hide the parts of herself that could be broken. But now, there was something different, something that didn't fit. The cowboy's voice was the only thing that broke the silence. "You don't have to be here. You don't have to be alone." The words were simple, but they hit her like a punch. Alone. She had been alone for so long, hadn't even realized how much it had weighed on her until now. She didn't know what to say. The rest of the barn remained unnervingly quiet. The men who had been watching silently up until now exchanged glances, the disbelief evident in their eyes. The air in the barn grew even thicker, and the cowboy could feel it, the weight of their stares, their judgment. What did this mean for them? For the ranch? For the rules they had all lived by for so long? The tension seemed to build with every second, each moment stretching out as the crowd waited for her response. The men watched with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as if waiting for something to shatter the stillness. What did this mean for them, for the life they had built here in the Texas ranch? Could they even imagine a world where one of them would marry a woman like her? A comfort girl, a symbol of everything they had been taught to hate? The woman didn't speak. The silence stretched on. The cowboy's offer hung in the air, unanswered, and the barn waited. The world outside seemed far away, the wind blowing softly against the walls, carrying the scent of distant rain. In that moment, it felt as if nothing would ever be the same again. And then, without warning, the woman took a slow step forward. It was so small, so quiet, but it was enough. Her eyes were still locked on the dirt, her hands trembling as they gripped her uniform. But she had moved. She hadn't said yes, she hadn't said anything, but she had moved. And that was enough to change everything. The next morning, the barn was quiet. The sounds of cattle and the soft rustling of hay filled the space, but they were not enough to fill the silence between them. The cowboy had given her a task, something simple, something small. She was to feed the chickens. The barn smelled of fresh straw, the scent thick and earthy, almost comforting. Each step she took stirred the dust on the floor, the gritty particles clinging to her shoes, the weight of every small movement grounding her further into the reality of this strange new place. She bent low to gather the feed, her hands trembling as they scooped the grain into her palm. The texture was rough, the hard edges of the kernels digging into her skin. At first, her fingers fumbled, unsure, unsteady. But as the birds circled her, their soft clucks filling the air, something inside her shifted. The chickens were innocent, unburdened by the weight of history, their small bodies moving in synchronized rhythm as they pecked eagerly at the ground. The sound was quiet, but it filled the barn in a way that was almost peaceful. It was a strange thing, this peace. It was something she had forgotten. Her hands, still shaking slightly, moved to scatter the feed, but with each passing moment, her grip became surer. The trembling in her fingers subsided, and she found a quiet rhythm, her actions almost automatic now. The small, steady movements of her hands, scooping the feed, tossing it in small arcs, felt familiar. It was as if this simple task, this small act of nurturing, was pulling her back into herself. The barn, once cold and indifferent, was now warm with the heat from the stove. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth seeped into her skin, spreading like a slow-burning fire, reaching her bones, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt it. Not the cold, the emptiness, but something different, something she hadn't realized she had missed comfort. The cowboy stood by the doorway, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his eyes watching her. He didn't say anything, just observed her, his gaze steady. She could feel it, even without looking directly at him. His eyes were not filled with judgment now, not with the silent scorn she had felt since she first arrived. He was watching her, yes, but there was something else there, a quiet interest. His gaze wasn't cold or calculating. It was thoughtful, almost curious, like he was seeing her for the first time. She didn't look up, but the awareness of his presence was there, in the back of her mind. She felt it in the weight of his eyes, in the way he stood, arms crossed, but not in a way that made her feel trapped. The tension between them had softened, as if the air in the barn had shifted too. She could hear the clucking of the chickens, their gentle noise providing a soundtrack to her slow, careful movements. Her frailty was still there. She could feel it in the way her bones ached, in the way her legs trembled after standing too long. But there was something more now, a shift, a subtle change that was hard to pinpoint, but undeniable. Her hands, once unsure and clumsy, had become steady. The grain, once difficult to hold, was now something she could work with. She moved with a purpose. The cowboy's gaze remained on her, watching as she scattered the feed, her movements fluid now, as if this task, this simple, quiet act, was doing something to her. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt her. There was no need for words. His silence, his watching, was its own kind of permission. Permission to be something else. She wasn't sure what that something else was. She wasn't sure how to name it. But with each handful of feed, with each soft cluck of the chickens, she felt something change inside her. It wasn't a grand transformation. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The silence in the barn was different now. Not oppressive, not filled with the weight of past judgments. It was a quiet, gentle thing. The barn, once a place of coldness, now felt alive with warmth. The heat from the stove, the soft rhythm of the chickens, the steady movement of her own hands, everything seemed to be in harmony, if only for a moment. And in that moment, she realized something. Something small, something fragile, but something that meant more than she could understand. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't just existing. She was becoming. Slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably. She threw one last handful of feed to the chickens, watching as they rushed forward, their small bodies moving in chaotic unity. She stood there for a moment, her hands still, the air thick with the scent of straw and the faint smoke of the fire. The cowboy was still watching her, but she no longer felt the weight of his gaze as she had before. She no longer felt like a thing to be examined, judged, or feared. For the first time in a long while, she felt human. The cowboy stepped quietly into the barn, the door creaking on its hinges as he moved toward her. In his hands, he held a small, worn book, the leather cover cracked with age, the pages yellowed. He didn't say anything as he approached, his boots making soft sounds on the barn floor. The warmth from the stove caught in the corners of the room, but the air still felt heavy with silence. He extended the book to her, his movements slow and careful. She hesitated for a moment, eyes flicking from the book to his face, then back down. Her hands were still shaking slightly, gripping the edges of her torn uniform. The barn smelled of fresh hay and the faint tang of wood smoke, but the scent of the old paper in the book was even stronger, filling the air with something unexpected. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the leather. The texture was rough under her touch, the edges of the cover soft from years of use. There was a faint scent of dust mixed with the paper's musty smell. She hesitated again before carefully opening the first page. The ink was faded, but still readable. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, the sound of the paper crisp in the silence. Each page felt fragile under her fingers. It was a book of songs, simple, handwritten notes, filled with words she didn't understand, but they didn't need to make sense to her. The act itself, the simple, unspoken gift, was enough. The cowboy didn't speak. He stood a few feet away, his eyes soft, but not expectant. He didn't push her to take it, didn't rush her. The moment stretched between them, neither of them breaking the quiet. She felt the weight of the book in her hands, the texture of the pages grounding her, pulling her attention away from the barn's rough wooden walls, from the coldness of the space. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something other than survival. She wasn't sure why, but something about the act, the quiet, simple kindness of it, was more than she could handle. The book was more than just words. It was a lifeline, something tangible, something that wasn't a demand or an expectation. It was just there. It wasn't like the food, the harsh treatments she had endured. It didn't ask for anything in return. She closed the book slowly, her fingers brushing the edges of the yellowed pages. It was the first real object she had touched that didn't remind her of pain or fear. The paper, the cover, the simple act of kindness, they were different. They weren't just about survival. They were about something else. The cowboy was still watching her, but his gaze didn't feel heavy anymore. It wasn't judgment or pity. It was something else, something soft, almost invisible in its quiet understanding. She couldn't explain it, but the air between them felt different. She wasn't just the enemy, not in this moment. She wasn't just a broken past. She took the book and tucked it under her arm, the weight of it comforting in a way she couldn't explain. The barn, the hay, the scent of smoke, they were no longer just reminders of captivity. They were part of something else now. The book had become her first anchor to a life she hadn't dared to imagine again. The cowboy nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. She didn't look at him as she stood, holding the book to her chest. But she knew, somehow, that this small gesture, this quiet, simple gift, had changed something inside her. She didn't know what yet, but she would. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The barn, still quiet and filled with the scent of fresh hay, settled into the soft rhythm of the evening. The faint creak of the wooden beams overhead blended with the breeze that rattled the barn's walls. The wind outside was gentle, carrying with it a soft, almost imperceptible scent of lavender that drifted through the cracks in the walls, mixing with the earthy smells of the barn. The warmth from the stove in the corner felt like a balm against the coldness that had once surrounded her. She stood by the doorway, the book still tucked under her arm, her fingers tracing the worn cover. The cowboy, standing a few feet away, didn't rush toward her. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his faded jeans, and his boots shifted slightly on the dirt floor as he watched her, his gaze steady but unhurried. He didn't say anything at first. He simply waited. His presence was calm, patient, like a steady current beneath a surface that had once been turbulent. The silence stretched between them. It wasn't the thick, oppressive kind she had grown accustomed to. This silence wasn't filled with fear or expectation. It felt different, softer somehow, like the barn had become a place where things could be said. She shifted slightly, her eyes still on the floor, the book's cover cool against her skin. It was the first time in a long while she had been given space, space to simply exist without judgment, without demand. She could feel his eyes on her, but it didn't press her down like it had before. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was strained, like the first dry crack of a storm that had been waiting to break. Her words were few, hesitant, but they were more than she had spoken since arriving. The chickens. They are easy. Her voice caught on the word, but it was there clearer than she had expected it to be. The cowboy didn't immediately respond. He waited, as if giving her time to gather more words, more thoughts. There was no rush in his demeanor. His silence was a quiet invitation, not a demand. He nodded slightly, acknowledging what she had said, but he didn't interrupt. For a long moment, the only sounds were the soft rustling of hay and the wind gently tugging at the barn door. It felt like a pause in time, a breath held in the space between them. Slowly, she spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time, though still strained. "I've done that before." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but the creak of the barn and the soft whisper of wind through the cracks. The cowboy took a slow step forward, his boots barely making a sound on the dirt floor. His eyes never left hers, his expression gentle but steady. "What else have you done?" he asked, his voice low and patient, like a man who had spent years learning the art of silence and waiting. The question wasn't hurried. It wasn't forced. He didn't press her for an answer, but the way he spoke made it clear he wanted to know her story, piece by piece, on her terms. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, her fingers now tracing the edge of the book she still held. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't look at them. Her focus was on him, on his quiet persistence. Finally, after a long silence, she answered. Her words came out in fragments, but there was something different now. I helped. I carried. Water. Scrubbed. The words were simple, clipped, but they held weight. Her voice, still strained, carried a note of something else, something deeper than the surface words she spoke. She was sharing, little by little. The cowboy didn't comment. He didn't nod in sympathy or offer praise. He just listened. His eyes remained on her, not judgmental, but open, and that was all. A subtle change rippled through the barn, like a breeze passing through the open door. It was no longer just a place of survival. The silence that had once hung like a heavy cloak now felt like space. Space for conversation, for something real. The wind outside had picked up again, ruffling the hay and stirring the air inside the barn. The room felt warmer now, the tension having dissipated into something softer, something human. She looked up at him then, her eyes not quite meeting his, but she didn't look away either. She didn't have more words to share just yet, but she knew this much. Something had shifted. Something in her had opened just a little, and it felt like the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. But the peace was fragile. The woman stood near the corner of the barn, her fingers brushing the edges of the book the cowboy had given her. She hadn't opened it since that first night, but she carried it with her everywhere, the worn leather a constant weight against her chest. Her hands were still shaking slightly, though less than before. She could feel the dust from the floor sticking to her bare feet, the roughness of the hay scratching at her legs. The barn, once a place of coldness and confinement, had become something more familiar. Yet now, there was something else in the air. A trace of anxiety, almost imperceptible, but present. She didn't want to admit it, but she had started to hesitate. The cowboy's presence, once a quiet force that grounded her, now felt more invasive. It wasn't his words, he had said little, if anything at all, but his actions. They were becoming deliberate, his every movement more pointed. He stepped closer now, without the softness he had once carried in his gaze. His eyes were still kind, but there was something different, something more intense in them. His gaze didn't waver, didn't flinch. He was waiting for her to move, for her to take the next step. Her hands trembled as she gripped the fabric of her torn uniform. The edges of the cloth were frayed, the seams pulled tight from the wear of too many days spent in the harshness of survival. Her fingers dug into the fabric, her nails catching on the rough fibers. She could feel the weight of his stare, the heat of his presence. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was there like the heat of the sun on a cloudless day, heavy and persistent. Why did she hesitate? The past clung to her, tight like a second skin. She had learned to mistrust, to survive. She had been taught that anything other than distance was a risk. To trust meant to expose yourself, to become vulnerable. It wasn't just the cowboy, not entirely. It was the fear of letting someone close, of letting anyone see the cracks in her armor. She had learned to hide them, to keep them buried beneath the weight of her uniform, beneath the dirt on her skin. But he wasn't giving up. The cowboy's movements were slow, deliberate, but they weren't forceful. He didn't push her, didn't demand her attention, but he was there, in her space, waiting. His presence was steady, unwavering, like the earth itself. Each time he stepped closer, the distance between them shortened, and so did the space in her chest. She could feel it, a slow, inexorable pull. His gaze didn't leave her. His eyes, soft yet unyielding, spoke without words. He was waiting for her to open up, to speak, to act, but he wasn't rushing her. There was no impatience in his movements, no urgency in his posture. He simply stood there, offering her space, but not backing away. Her breath caught in her throat, shallow and quick, as she took a hesitant step back. The barn seemed to close in around her, the familiar scent of hay now tinged with something else, a flicker of unease, like the distant rumble of thunder. She could feel the weight of her past pushing against her, a constant reminder of everything she had left behind, everything she had been taught to forget. But the cowboy didn't retreat. He took another step forward, and the distance between them became even smaller. She could hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floor, the faintest whisper of movement as he closed in, his eyes never leaving hers. She wasn't sure when it happened, but the barn had changed. The air had shifted, thickening with tension. The barn, once a place of survival, now felt like a space where something was being born. Something fragile, something uncertain, but real. Her heart hammered in her chest as she gripped the fabric of her uniform tighter. The cowboy's quiet persistence was forcing her to confront something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years: connection. The gap between them had closed. Her hesitation, her resistance, was all that remained. The cowboy wasn't asking her to speak, to share everything all at once. But every small gesture, every quiet moment, was chipping away at the walls she had built. He wasn't pushing, he was simply present. And that was enough. The barn had grown quieter, the distant wind now a soft whisper against the walls. The occasional creak of wood, the subtle shift of the air, all punctuated the silence that surrounded them. She stood, her back to the light from the door, the warmth from the stove still lingering in the air, but it wasn't enough to soften the weight she felt pressing down on her chest. The cowboy stood a few feet away, his presence quiet but unmistakable, waiting for her. The barn smelled of fresh hay and the lingering scent of sweat, the air thick with the weight of their shared space. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the wooden table beside her. The rough texture of the wood dug into her skin as her nails pressed into the surface, a physical anchor, something solid to hold on to in this moment of uncertainty. The wood, weathered and worn by time, felt alive beneath her touch, as if it could speak to her of all that had come before. The cowboy didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, waiting. His eyes, soft but unwavering, remained fixed on her. He had not rushed her before, and he wasn't rushing her now. He wasn't demanding anything. But the air between them was thick with the question that she knew had to be answered. Did she take a step forward, or did she remain in the past? The decision felt like it was carved into her bones, the weight of it heavier than anything she had ever carried before. Her body, tense and rigid, seemed to rebel against the vulnerability she felt. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself to take the next step, to leave the past behind and move forward into something she wasn't sure she could handle? Her breath came in shallow bursts as she gripped the table tighter. The rough wood pressed against her fingertips, the pain of it grounding her in the reality of the moment. She wasn't sure what was scarier, the idea of moving forward or the thought of staying stuck in the past, frozen in the memories of everything she had endured. The cowboy's presence didn't push her. He didn't speak, didn't make any move to change the moment. But he was there, standing quietly, his gaze unwavering. He had not asked for anything from her, and he wasn't asking now. But she could feel his patience, his quiet support. He wasn't going anywhere. He was waiting for her, but he wasn't forcing her to choose. The woman's fingers, now white with the pressure, finally loosened from the table. The wood was marked by her grip, the small indents left by her nails as a reminder of the internal struggle she was facing. The weight of the history she carried with her, the shame, the fear pressed down on her chest, threatening to choke her. But the cowboy's stillness, his calmness, was like a lifeline, a quiet invitation to take a chance, to trust again. She stood there for what felt like an eternity. The silence, heavy and full of possibility. The barn around them had become more than just a place of survival. It had become a space where something could change, where something could grow. Her hand, now trembling slightly, moved away from the table, the roughness of the wood still lingering on her skin. For a moment, she didn't know what to do, where to go. But in that moment, she realized something she had already taken the first step. She was here. She was still standing. The decision didn't come in a rush. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming flood of certainty. But in the way her fingers relaxed, in the way her stance shifted, something had changed. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew one thing: this was the beginning of something new. The barn, the cowboy, the weight of her past, they all existed in this moment. And for the first time, the choice felt like something she could face. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, not with fear, but with something else, a quiet resolve. And in that moment, as the weight of history still pressed against her chest, she realized that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The barn seemed to hold its breath. The familiar smell of straw filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wind carrying through the cracks in the barn's walls. The distant rustle of leaves in the trees outside was the only sound that pierced the thick silence. Inside, the room felt heavy with expectation, the air thick with a tension that had been building for days. She stood there for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on him. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He simply waited. His presence was calm, his gaze steady. But something had shifted. Something was different now. The space between them wasn't filled with fear or uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with possibility. The weight of the moment pressed down, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It felt like a chance, something fragile, but something worth taking. Then, without warning, she stepped toward him. Her feet shifted in the dirt, the soft scrape of her boots against the floor almost too loud in the stillness. She didn't stop. Slowly, carefully, she closed the distance between them. Her heart raced in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. Yet something inside her kept pushing her forward. The cowboy didn't move at first. He simply watched her, his breath caught in his chest, his heart pounded, but he didn't retreat. His eyes stayed on hers, steady, not with disbelief, but with a quiet recognition. There was no hesitation in him, no reluctance, only a slow, almost imperceptible understanding. She was coming toward him. She was choosing to step into something different, something new. She reached out. Her hand trembled as it stretched toward him, the small, delicate fingers shaking as they closed the gap between them. The roughness of her skin, worn from days of hard labor, brushed against his, but the touch was soft, tentative. The barn seemed to exhale as her hand met his. Her fingers wrapped around his hand, and for a brief moment, there was nothing else in the world but the warmth that passed between them. The room went still. The air, once thick with tension, now felt lighter, as if the walls of the barn had exhaled with them. It was as though the very act of her reaching out had released something that had been holding them both back. The tension that had once suffocated the space between them now evaporated into something else, something softer, something that felt like the first breath of freedom. The cowboy didn't speak. He didn't need to. His fingers closed gently around hers, the calluses on his hands brushing against the soft skin of hers. The touch wasn't just an offering. It was a promise, a quiet understanding. He didn't rush her. He didn't pull her in. He simply held her hand, letting her feel the security in his grip. There was no pressure, no demands. It was the act of trust, pure and simple. For the woman, the act of reaching out, of placing her hand in his, was more than just a gesture. It was a decision, a choice to trust, to move beyond the past, to step into a world where she wasn't alone. Her hand in his was a physical manifestation of everything she had held back: the fear, the shame, the uncertainty. In that simple touch, she was letting go of it, letting go of the walls she had built. The cowboy, surprised by the quiet power of the moment, didn't pull away. He wasn't reluctant. He wasn't shocked by the decision. He had known, in some quiet corner of himself, that this moment was coming. But even so, when her hand reached for his, it struck him with a force he hadn't expected. He hadn't realized how badly he had wanted this. And in that moment, the barn changed. The scent of straw, the faint sound of the wind outside, they no longer felt like reminders of survival. The barn had been a place of refuge, of pain, of distance. But now, it was a space of possibility. It was no longer just a place where they had existed. It was a space where they could become something more. Her hand still in his, they stood there together in the silence. The barn, with its rough walls and weathered beams, had transformed before their eyes. The room was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where something new was beginning. Something that had been impossible just days ago. Something they could both build together. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so distant. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, but the warmth of the day still lingered in the barn. The air, now filled with the scent of hay, wood, and the faintest trace of the woman's perfume, felt light, almost comforting. It was no longer just the smell of survival. The barn, once a place of fear and tension, had shifted. The shadows, once oppressive, now seemed to hold a new meaning, bathed in the soft, flickering light of the evening. The cowboy and the woman stood side by side, their hands still clasped, but the distance between them was gone. The years of shame, of pain, had been chipped away, piece by piece, until all that remained was this new reality. There were no more walls between them, no more history to define their actions. Just the barn. Just the moment. The cowboy's decision had been unexpected. In a world where the line between enemy and ally was drawn in blood, he had defied it. He had chosen something that no one expected: a woman once labeled with shame, now standing beside him as his equal. His choice was one of trust, one of belief in something greater than the labels society had placed upon them both. The woman, once a prisoner of her past, no longer wore the weight of that past in the same way. She had changed. Her body, though still thin, now stood taller, stronger, more sure. Her hands, once trembling with uncertainty, were now steady. The ragged uniform that had once clung to her like a shroud now seemed to fit differently, as if it were part of a life she was leaving behind. Her eyes, which had once been clouded with fear, now shone with something different clarity. There was no longer a flicker of hesitation when she looked at him. She saw him for who he was, and he saw her for who she was. Her journey wasn't one of grand gestures. It wasn't a journey from captivity to freedom, but a journey of small, transformative steps, each one moving her closer to herself. The book the cowboy had given her had been her first anchor, her first connection to a world beyond survival. But it was more than that. It had been the beginning of a change. a change that had rippled through every part of her being, softening the walls she had built to protect herself. Now, standing beside him, she wasn't just a symbol. She was a woman. The barn, once a prison, was now a place of healing, of love. The physical anchor, the barn, the book, the uniform. The hands had shifted completely. The rough wooden beams that had once seemed suffocating now held the weight of something different. The same walls that had borne witness to her fear and isolation now stood as silent witnesses to something new. A beginning, not an end. The cowboy didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the steady grip of his hand in hers, said everything. The woman didn't need to say anything either. The transformation had already taken place, not in words, but in actions. In the quiet moments, in the trust, in the choices they had made together. Together, they were no longer prisoners of their pasts. And as the barn filled with the warmth of their shared presence, they both knew this was only the beginning. Her hand in his, she stood tall and proud, no longer burdened by the weight of shame. Her life had been forever changed by the cowboy's decision, by the quiet gift of trust. Together, they would walk forward into the future, no longer defined by what had been, but by what they would create. If this story moved you, please like the video and comment below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and your thoughts on the transformation in this story.